Well, good morning. Glad to be with you all today. So it's a real privilege when churches invite us in to do this and have this very important conversation, have this very important training. So as Umberto said, I'm Mike Sloan. I'm the Director of Safeguarding at Grace. I've been doing this work for a while, but one of the reasons I do this work is because I had internships, I had years of seminary training, but no one really prepared me as a future pastor to think about these issues and to know what is the role of a leader, a pastor, some kind of church. You know, some of you are here as formal church leaders. Some of you have a lot of power informally in the church as leaders. What does it mean to be a leader where we're cultivating a strong culture of protection and doing all that we can to protect not just kids, but really anyone, and to really work on a strong culture where we have a strong, an environment of safety, an environment of respect. So that's really what this training is all about. And I'm very passionate about this because, as I said, I went into ministry, and it was in ministry before I had any training. When someone came to our church and offered to do training for us, that I began to learn about these issues many years ago. Of course, went on a journey, and now this is where God has me, is helping churches with this very idea. So glad to be with you today. We're going to have several hours before us, as Umberto said, but I think it's going to be incredibly valuable because we're going to have a lot of interaction. Everything you're going to get a lot of information today. So if you're a note taker like me, first of all, know the slides are going to be given to you. So take any notes you need to, but know that the slides are going to be made available to you. We're going to walk through a lot of scenarios, talk a lot about different ideas. And again, the singular focus, the singular goal of this training is to better equip you as a leader to contribute and cultivate that strong culture of protection that we would need in churches. And as we'll see, this is connected to the heart of God very deeply. So just a little bit about Grace and a few other preliminary things before we dive in. We've existed as a nonprofit Christian ministry since 2004. We literally have hundreds of churches and many survivors reaching out to us every single year. Our very simple mission is to educate and empower churches to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. And so we are, we are not just in this work on a weekly basis, but we are talking in conversation with survivors on a weekly basis. And so what fires me up is when we have churches like you who are ready to take a more proactive stance. And that is really what makes all the difference in this area. So very glad to be with you today. And that makes all the difference. So we're going to give you some education. We're going to give you some tools as leaders. And the key is that you're continuing to learn and grow. And that's why you have already invited us here, is because you want to work on that and do that. So that just encourages me so much. Thank you. A couple of things about self-care, because this is a heavy topic. And really in a room of any size, there are going to be survivors of abuse in that room, statistically speaking. But I just want to say this. If you are a survivor of abuse, just know that no one is going to be put on the spot today in terms of your personal story. I think it's very important, and we as an organization think it's very important, that survivors are free to talk about their story when they feel ready to do that, when they feel safe to do that, with someone they choose and trust to share that story with. So we don't put anyone on the spot in a training like this. And just as a general word of encouragement, I want everyone to just try to think about what you need to care for yourself as we go through the next few hours together. We are not intentionally putting in this training anything graphic or shocking. You're not going to see pictures of children with bruises or anything like that. At the same time, are we going to talk directly about these issues and have some frank conversation? Yes, we are. So just be aware of what you need to take care of yourself in the midst of that, whatever that is for you. So whether it's using some strategies like just doing some deep breathing and paying attention to your breathing. Just feeling the weight of your feet on the floor, the weight of your back on your chair, just to kind of stay grounded and present. That can be a helpful tool. Some Christian therapists have taught me some other tools that I use all the time. Just holding a hot cup of coffee or tea can really help keep us calm and present. Getting some ice water, swishing some cold water around your mouth can do wonders as well. Whatever it is, and if you need to take a break, even if we're not on a break, I just want to give everyone permission. If you need to move around the room, stand up at the back, step out and get some nice fresh air on this cool day. I'm told this is about as cold as it gets here in this area. So sorry to bring the cold with me from Virginia. Yeah, so I pastored in Atlanta and Ohio, but I'm from Virginia and live there now. So yeah, definitely brought the cold with me from Virginia, so you're welcome. But whatever you need to do to care for yourself, please do so. And just know that's not going to bother me one bit. I expect you will need to move around at some point. We're humans. And then, as Umberto said, we'll take regular breaks. So about on the hour, we'll take regular breaks. And then, after the third hour, we'll do our lunch. All right. So I told you about the slides, self-care. Anything else logistically we need to get out there before we dive in from anyone? All right, good deal. All right, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to structure the training. I want you to know where we're going because, instead of just wondering, where are we? What are we talking about? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have an introductory part of the training that will be most of this first segment before our first break. We're going to talk about this idea that as leaders, we make the difference in setting the culture on these issues. We make a real difference with abuse prevention and response in a church setting. What does that mean? What does that look like? So we're going to introduce some basic ideas about that. We're going to do some foundational work to talk about what do we mean by the word abuse? Like, what is that? Not every kind of harm is abuse. And so we need to get real specific about what we mean by that and talk about what are common dynamics that is helpful for all of us to understand with regard to abuse. And we'll use some scenarios to talk about that. And we'll ask a very important question: how does prevention work? That's what we're after as leaders, right? That's a huge reason why we're here. How does prevention actually work in a church setting? And at the end of that introduction, we're going to introduce a 4-part framework that we're going to leave with you as leaders. It's a 4-part framework that we think is really the 4 critical areas for leaders to cultivate and focus on to do excellent work with both prevention and response to abuse in a church setting. And that will be, so we'll introduce that at the end of the introduction, and that will be the 4-part structure we'll use for the rest of the training. We'll walk through each of those 4 areas all together and talk about what does it mean to be a leader in each of these 4 areas in a church setting. All right, so let's dive in and talk about this first idea, that leaders make the difference. So here's a hard thought, and I'm going to introduce an idea from an abuse researcher. Her name is Dr. Anna Salter. She traveled to prison after prison after prison and interviewed abusers, people who offended against children or women or other people. And one of her conclusions from her extensive research is that offenders are very intentional about what they do. And that's an upsetting and that's a hard thought for most of us because we just don't think that way. We don't think with a predatory mindset like that. And she said offenders can actually recognize ideal settings for abuse even if the rest of us can't. So she's saying there are things that abusers would look for in a setting, in a context, in a culture, in a community that they can use to their advantage. She goes on to say it's precisely our lack of knowledge that gives predators their edge. And that's one of the things that offenders take advantage of. When there's no education or knowledge of these issues, there's a void there that they can take advantage of. What encourages me, as hard as it is to think about that level of intentionality, what encourages me is that Jesus said fairly similar things that Dr. Salter is saying. I don't know if you've ever thought of it this way, but in a context in Matthew where Jesus was talking about wolves and sheep, by the way, was Jesus just really into agriculture and farming and all of it? What is the metaphor? The point of that metaphor is he's talking about people, right? And how people can interact in the world. And what is the point of the metaphor of wolves and sheep? Is that how do wolves act towards the vulnerable sheep? They act in a very intentionally predatory way. So in Matthew 10, Jesus says, we need to understand this and be aware of this. And he challenges his followers, his disciples, that we are to be like doves. We're not to be like the wolf. In fact, we're to be as far from a wolf in how we interact with humans as possible. So think of the dove. That's how you're to be. You're to be harmless and innocent like that. But that's not enough, he says. We need to also be wise as serpents. We need to understand these issues. That's exactly what Dr. Salter, I think, was saying. We have to understand how people can try to take advantage of others, how people can try to exploit and violate others. Jesus is saying we need to understand that. We need to be wise as serpents. Of course, this is not the first time in Matthew Jesus has talked about wolves and sheep. He has the very famous statement, we've all heard before, I'm sure, that we need to beware of one who is like a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? And in this context, he's talking about a leader who has power. And I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, but when Jesus is talking about beware of one who's like a wolf in sheep's clothing, what he's doing is he's basically talking about common abuse dynamics. Because what is he talking about? He's saying when someone in a faith community, like a leader, has bad intentions, because in the context he's talking about a false teacher, right, a false prophet. When someone has bad intentions like that, they don't show up and walk in the front door of the church and say, "Where are the children? Bring them to me. I'm here to gobble them up." Of course not. They walk in the front door and everyone knows them and everyone expects them to be there. And they look and act just like everyone else. And they pray like the other pastors and leaders. And their true intention is hidden. And that's a very calculated, intentional hiding of who they truly are. And that's the whole wolf in sheep's clothing part, right? They intentionally present themselves as something they're not. So what Jesus is talking about is someone who is known, someone who is trusted. Someone, in this case, who has power and who is using deception and manipulation, not just toward a potential person they might try to take advantage of, but really the whole community. Do you see that? And he's talking about someone who, of course, is looking for someone who is more vulnerable in some way. That's common abuse dynamics. Those are the things that Dr. Salter and other researchers talk about when they talk about what abuse is and how it works. Jesus has been talking about this. Our Jesus has been talking about this and has been aware of this and wants us to understand this. Now, here's another thing for us as leaders. I'm just going to take a safe example. So many of us are aware of the awful case, egregious case, of abuse by Larry Nassar. He was the doctor in USA Gymnastics and at Michigan State. Okay? Some of us saw the sentencing where many of the survivors spoke at his sentencing a few years ago. That got a lot of coverage in the news, right? Nationally. And many of those survivors said this very simple yet very profound point. Do you remember? They said, "We're glad Larry is going to prison for the rest of his life. But what we need now is for the institutions who enabled him for years to do the work of being more accountable and fixing the systems that enabled him for years." And how can it be because this is what's been established now in the wake of that awful situation. How can it be that 8 individuals have come forward with very credible, serious allegations of his abuses, and still he's in his office seeing minors and young men and women? How can that be? What kind of culture is that? How can 14 higher officials in the Michigan State University system have knowledge of those very credible, very serious allegations of abuse, and still Larry is in his office seeing patients? How does that, what kind of culture is that? And how does that happen? And one of the things that other experts, Dr. Diane Langberg is one of our founding board members, she says, look, one of the things offenders are looking for in a system, in a culture, is a culture that will prioritize the system, the institution, over the individual. That's absolutely one of the things that offenders will look for. So as leaders who have meetings about our institution and budgets and buildings, like, we have to wrestle with that dynamic. And we have to ask hard questions about what kind of culture are we cultivating in this area. And the good news is, and I picked Larry Nassar because that's a little bit of a safe example, because that's way over there and it's not in a church, you know, but that's where we need to bring it back to, we're all leaders. You know, I'm a leader, you're leaders. You know, your church, my church in Virginia, we have to ask hard questions of ourselves and be self-aware and self-reflective. What kind of a culture are we building? And the good news is, we have the power to do the things necessary to work on the culture needed. We can work on that. And I think you're already doing many of those things. It's just about continuing that. And so again, that encourages me greatly. So we're going to continue to unpack that. And really that's what this whole training is about, in the 4-part framework that we're coming to shortly. Let's do a little more foundational work though, just to get on the same page. What do we mean by abuse? What does that mean? So in church, we say things like, we are all sinners. Amen? Amen. We are all sinners. But abuse is not a sin like other sins. And I think it's very important to say that. Abuse is a very egregious type of sin that does incredible damage to someone. So here's a good, I think, general definition of abuse. Abuse occurs when a person holding power and trust, almost always it's someone holding trust. It's someone known usually. And they're using that power and trust to exploit or violate a person who is more vulnerable in some way. Now, vulnerabilities can take all different shapes and sizes. Vulnerabilities can be just developmentally because you're a child. It can be because of all different reasons. But let's leave that there for the moment. But do you see, even in this general definition, why abuse is more damaging than just any kind of... All sin is damaging. We believe that as Christians. But abuse is particularly destructive. Why? It's because the actual vehicle for the violation and exploitation is coming through that relationship of trust. Someone you know typically. So whether it's a coach or a parent or a teacher or a pastor, it's, you know, a relative, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, someone who you know, you trust, who should have been protective, and there is a deep betrayal of that. And so that's not a surface wound, that's not a scratch, that's a deep wound to our personhood. And of course, abuse can come in all different forms. It can really come in any form, any way we can be human, that can be abused or misused. So it can be physical or sexual, emotional, spiritual, financial, and so forth. But at the core of it is this idea of power and trust being weaponized. The Bible recognizes that. Here's one example. I won't give you all the verses, but here's one example. And this is a lament from Ecclesiastes. Again, I saw the oppressions that are done under the sun. And oppression is the more common biblical word that would often correlate to our word that we use in English in our day and age for abuse. Behold the tears of the oppressed. They had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. So here's this lament, this heart cry to God in feeling powerless. Why? Because the people who have power and are using power to exploit, no one's there to stop them. There's no one with power stepping in to interrupt it. And so there's this deep feeling of powerlessness. And so we're crying out to God for help in that, right? And the Bible recognizes this core dynamic of power. We'll see that throughout the training today in other core dynamics as well. A critical distinction in all abuse is that there is someone abusing power and sinning against another person. And then there is a person being sinned against. This is not two people sinning mutually. That does happen. We all know that. But abuse, and that's a critical distinction. And here was what I want to challenge you with as a leader. For most of us, this makes sense to us. For many of our people in our church, they don't have this category yet, and they need this category. And who is going to give them that category? It has to be you. You know, we'll do that in our training when we do the training for the whole congregation, but it has to be you, and you guys have to get this, clearly so that you can help bring clarity for this. There are many survivors of abuse in church pews who think, I am a sinner, I sinned sexually. Well, no, they were sexually abused, actually. That's what happened. And because they don't have this category. So in abuse, there is someone sinning and someone being sinned against. There's a perpetrator and a victim, we might say, right? And that's so critical. And as we'll see, the Bible recognizes that dynamic. So let's talk about using the first scenario. In just a second, we'll use the first scenario. But here are a few other core dynamics. So we've already mentioned most of these, but by way of summary, we talk about abuse and common dynamics. These are often the common dynamics at work. And as I mentioned, so when we see on a week-by-week basis when we're doing consultation and other work with churches, we see this time and time and time again. So we see this in the research and researchers like Dr. Anna Salter. We see this in our work experientially, week by week. We see these dynamics over and over. It involves power, someone holding power and abusing that power and weaponizing that power, and someone who's more vulnerable in some way. There's trust that an abuser holds, and it's not just trust over an individual, though it is. It's trust in a church setting, within that church community typically. And it's not just churches, it's wherever it's happening, it's trust within that community typically. Abuse involves entitlement thinking by the abuser. I can do what I want, I can take what I want, and no one is going to stop me. Now they might not say it that overtly, but if you read Psalm 10, which we'll do later in the training, that's exactly what's going on in the heart of an abuser, and God knows it. God sees it. And to treat someone, to dehumanize them, that's to objectify them, that's very destructive. And as we saw in the words of Jesus, there's a calculated deception often at work, a calculated manipulation. We might say it, so Jesus said, beware of the one who's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. We might say it, someone's living a double life, essentially. That's how we might phrase it in more updated language. Many offenders will try to isolate and render powerless their victims in various ways. And that will be in all different types of tactics, like using threats, fear, in other ways. Shame is a common tactic to try to silence someone from speaking up, from getting help, if that makes sense. All right. So most of these are in the words of Jesus, just in that Matthew 7 passage. and bringing in a few other ideas, these are common dynamics that abuse researchers recognize. So let's just practice reading. I'm going to read this first scenario, and I'm going to give you 5 minutes at your tables to just talk about. Does everyone have a copy? Okay. So I'll read this first scenario. I'm just going to give you 5 minutes to talk about, do you see these dynamics in this little vignette, in this scenario 1? All right. Here's the first one. A middle school student seeks out the help of his student pastor regarding his depression. His parents are getting divorced and he's taking this very hard. The pastor gets the parents' permission to meet regularly with the student, to talk, to do Bible study, and pray. Eventually, the pastor convinces the student to do counseling sessions, quote unquote, and Bible study in the nude with him and masturbate together. The pastor tells him, God needs you to trust him completely. The student is confused by all of this, but he trusts this pastor and is embarrassed and scared to tell anyone. The pastor says the student can't tell anyone, or the ministry will suffer and people will go to hell because of him. All right, do you see any of these dynamics at work? So just have a conversation around that. And I'll call you back in 5 minutes. So get specific if you can. Where do you see these? All right, I'm going to call you back. I know I didn't give you tons of time, but let's just talk about this together a little bit as well. Can maybe just a few of you share, if you're willing, what is something that especially stood out to you? Was there any of these that you were like, wow, you thought that was notable, important to point out, in terms of what's going on here? What would you say?
Just
yes?
The blatant in your face, come with me and do this.
Okay.
Brash.
Sure. Just the brazenness of it, the brashness of it. Yeah. Okay. Someone else? Yes.
I'd say it's just the vulnerability of this child. Like, he's
Yeah.
isolated, his parents are getting divorced, so he feels alone anyway, and
Right.
he's like the perfect prey for something like this.
Yes. And we know this now, unfortunately, from research. These are often the types of kids that an offender would look for. They would look for a kid who's more isolated to begin with because of maybe the family situation, like what's going on here. Or there's a mental health issue or a health issue, and that's, there's some type of thing that is even more of a vulnerability. So all children are vulnerable because they're not fully developed yet. So they have vulnerabilities from that. But of course, given this family situation, given the mental health issues at play, this kid is more vulnerable than most. And that is noticed. And notice again the intentionality there. That's a core dynamic, right? Okay, good. What else do you see here that you think is noteworthy? Yes?
The trust in community. I mean,
Yeah.
asked the parents' permission, so it wasn't just doing it behind their back or anything.
Right.
about it.
Which probably part of us is like, okay, isn't that good? Yes, right? Getting parents' permission, that seems good. It's important, though, to know getting a parent's permission for something doesn't necessarily ensure safety. Of course, those are two different issues. So we want parental permission for things, good. At the same time, we need to be aware of what actually makes a difference in terms of safety. And notice in this case, that kind of gave a cover for moving to more frequent interactions and more isolated interactions. And so that was an issue. That was exploited. Okay? That trust was exploited. Okay, what else did you see? Yes?
With regards to that point, we as parents are obviously trusting the leadership and think it would be a good thing to do Bible study and that kind of thing.
Sure.
We're not looking to investigate the circumstances surrounding that. I mean, it's sad to think about.
Yeah, of course it is, right? There's often a trust that we have that churches are just going to be safe. And most of the time, there is safety. but that is also something that could be taken advantage of, right, and exploited. So we have to think very carefully, how do we set things up so there is accountability and transparency? And how do we avoid, so we'll get into that discussion more in just a moment. That's very good. All right, maybe one more, yeah.
It doesn't tell where these Bible studies were taking place.
Yeah.
But wherever it was very private.
Yes.
Able to conduct something like that. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, and notice that the isolation, that was not something achieved instantaneously, but something that this youth pastor worked toward and certainly gained. And I'll just say a couple of other points to note, and we just don't have time to dissect the whole scenario, but is this entitled behavior? For someone to treat a student this way, and make no mistake, when an adult does this with a student, they are gratifying themselves sexually. It's very entitled behavior. It's very dehumanizing to the student. That's what's happening, and it's abuse. And notice that a lot of the powerful tools of manipulation are connected to spirituality. Because in a church setting, those are often the more powerful tools that you can use for good purposes, but you can also twist them and use them for evil purposes. And this individual is doing some really evil twisting. Notice how you need to trust God completely. What does that really mean functionally? It means you need to listen to me and what I'm telling you. And if you say something, the kingdom of God could be destroyed and the church's ministry could be destroyed, essentially. When you tell that to a kid, whether they grew up in church or have been in church, that's devastating and that's powerful. As someone who grew up in church, you know, when someone says things like that to you as a teenager, as a young person, when you've grown up in church or been in church for a while, you know, that absolutely, and especially when it comes from a leader, that is incredibly powerful and incredibly manipulative. Okay? All right, there's much more we could say about that, but let's keep going. I do want to bring it back to positively. Okay, it's not, the goal of this is not just to sit in negative stories and terrible stories. The goal is, okay, what are we going to do about this? And how does prevention actually work? So we're going to go right into our next scenario. And here's what I want to challenge you. So I'm going to read this little scenario, and I'm going to ask you to do a similar discussion around your tables for a few minutes. But here's the key question. What could leaders at this church, so put yourself in the place of this as leaders at this church, what could the leaders of this church do ahead of time to bring prevention, to bring safety in this scenario? What do you think could make a difference in this specific scenario? Things that leaders can absolutely do and work on. That's the question we're going to talk about. So here's the scenario. Again, it's a student ministry scenario. Erica is 13 years old. She's grown up in the church and loves her church and her pastors. Tony, her student pastor, is a seminary graduate and an ordained pastor. He is funny and charismatic. He's a great Bible teacher. The kid's not a theological charismatic. He's charismatic personality-wise. He's a great Bible teacher. The kids love him and the parents love him because they see kids wanting to go to church. Tony's colleagues also love and appreciate that he's helping draw more families to the church. On a particular Wednesday night, when student ministry is winding down, only a few people are left waiting around the foyer of the church. Erica's mom is running late to pick her up. Tony says to Erica, "Hey, I've got something for you I forgot earlier. Come with me to my office for a second." Tony and Erica start walking away from everyone toward a back hallway and Tony's office. No one is in that part of the church at this time, and it's very isolated. As Tony and Erica turn a corner, they pass a young mom in the church who ran back in to grab her son's coloring paper that he left in the classroom. Now, what could church leaders do ahead of time for this young mom to see, oh, here is an adult and a student, and they're going away from everyone else to a more isolated part of the church. What could leaders do ahead of time that could help that mom maybe intervene? Or what could have helped prevention in this scenario? What can leaders do ahead of time? So just talk about that for just a few minutes, and then we'll talk all together.
Well, but
All right, I know again I didn't give you much time, but you started a conversation, so let's bring the conversation all together and have it together. Who wants to start us off? Someone willing? What would you say? What's something leaders can do ahead of time? Yeah, what would you say?
First of all, this guy shouldn't have gone back to an office by
Yeah.
himself with a student. That's just stupid. Like, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I don't. You're not wrong.
It's a red flag. It's like every leader should know. Like you're not. Even if it was a guy with a guy, it's like you shouldn't be alone
Yeah.
with another student.
Yeah.
That you're asking for trouble right there. So alarm bell should be going off in his head.
Yeah. First of all, it's a super simple situation to solve, as many situations are. Erica, wait right here. There's a book in my office I've been meaning to get to you. If your mom comes, just hold on for a sec. I'll be back in 2 minutes. Like, that's literally how easy. And especially leaders like a student pastor should be exemplary with those types of boundaries, for sure. So yeah, you're not wrong. Absolutely. Okay, good. What else would you say? Yes.
Make it clear that the person who sees that situation should intervene.
Okay.
Maybe say something like, "Can I accompany you?"
So make it clear that intervention is a good thing and give empowerment for that. Now, probably for most of us to think a little bit about, are most people who don't hold any role going to feel comfortable calling out a pastor? That might be for some a challenge. And so how do we work on a culture where we're giving empowerment and encouragement? I think as a former pastor myself, for me to stand up and say, hey, our policy is for everyone. It's for me. It's for all of our pastors and leaders. It's for everyone. All of us as Christians are called to be accountable. That's what a disciple is. Someone who's teachable, someone who's accountable. And all of us are subject to this policy. And to give empowerment like that, that's not going to be enough for every person, but it's going to help some people to know. And it's good to say, I think, to people, if you don't feel safe to intervene or like you can do that, come get a leader or someone else who can immediately. So you could say, I think, like you said, can I just walk with you? Or, hey, remember our policy. Can we just, can you just go get the book and or I'll go with you. Yeah, again, there's so many easy ways to solve it. Okay. And by the way, statistically, we know a lot of abuse occurs for sexual abuse of minors in one adult, one child situations. We think it's about 80% of cases boil down to that situation. So if we can put a boundary in place at church ministry times and say, unless you're with your own kid, which is fine, no worries there, that just shouldn't happen. And, it's not that we can't have mentoring or one-on-one conversation, but we can set up pathways for that are still kind of in more visible areas that are not isolated. So if we reduce those situations, that's a key step toward prevention. So that's really important. Okay, what else would you say?
I think parents sorry.
No, go for it.
I think just parents making sure that their children are aware of the policy as well. And
Yeah.
That way the girl is like, oh no, I shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Most church kids, though, are they going to feel comfortable saying something? I would say a lot of them are not, but it's not that we don't do what you're saying. What you're saying is right on. We have those conversations, but we know the main strategy we're using is for the adults to be responsible and accountable and to uphold those boundaries. We tell the kids what the boundaries are, we give them empowerment and courage, but we don't make them the main strategy for speaking up, So I agree with you. Does that make sense? And so education. In churches, most churches, I would say, who do training on abuse, though, a lot of churches tend to get very narrowly focused on their staff and volunteers who work with kids. But what most boundary crossings or unsafe situations, most of those are happening, though, when? Outside of the structured ministry, in the hallways, after church, in the parking lot, in the workday, when there's just, it's more informal, or in a home or some other setting. And that's where most minor abuse against minor occurs, by the way, as well. Actual abuse is more occurring not in structured ministries when it's connected to churches. It does, but often in more unstructured times and in homes. So to really make an impact in a church, so we're talking about empowerment, we're talking about education, we have to think, how do we fill in those gaps that usually exist in empowerment and education? There's usually a gap in educating. If we only educate our staff or volunteers who work with students, well, I don't know how many times churches have reached out to us about a concerning individual who doesn't work with the students or the kids, but he's interacting with minors in a concerning way just in the sanctuary after church or in the hallways or in some other setting. And churches have to account for that as well. So that's why the training we're going to be doing for your whole congregation, giving all the adults that basic awareness training, that is really critical. So that's so important. Okay, maybe one other. What else did you talk about? And we've already kind of implied having that boundary, so that there'll be another key one if we're keeping track. Empowerment, education, a clear boundary. Just don't be alone with a kid who's not your kid. That's a boundary, and that's a boundary for our church. That would be a good. So having a policy, and that raises questions too. Who understands and knows the policy? So that's a leadership issue. In most churches, because we review policy after policy after policy, and we have for years now, most policies address what? Structured ministry with kids and the volunteers and staff who work in structured ministry with kids. But technically, a lot of those policies don't address this situation because it's after the student ministry meeting, formally. It's just in the hallway after, walking down back to the offices or whatever. So we need to do some work there. And so those basic things, though, having clear boundaries, like a boundary about isolation and one-on-one interactions, having education and empowerment, I think a lot of that is common sense to most of us. So I don't think it's anything radical we're advocating for, but notice those things don't just happen if we don't work on them as leaders. There will be gaps if we don't continue to make progress and work on those as leaders. And that gets back to, to our culture. Culture really makes the difference. Do we have a culture that I would never think of asking a student to go back with me toward the back part of the church when no one else is there? And we have a culture that the other adults who are waiting around in the foyer would say, hey, Tony, what are you doing? You can't do that. Stop. And we're going to intervene. And that's our culture. And, that's what really makes the difference. And we have to engage people in such a way. We're not after stoking paranoia. That doesn't help anything. And we'll talk about that a lot with the congregation-based training. We're not advocating for being scared at church or paranoia, but what we are advocating for is taking a responsible approach and working that, hey, all of us make a difference in this area. All of us in a community, in a church community, contribute to this being a place of safety and respect. And all of us have a role in that. So making that clear as leaders and working on those key areas really makes a difference. So here are the 4 areas of the framework that, as we conclude this first part of the training, here are the things that, and at this point I think this will make sense to you. As leaders, these are the 4 areas we can attend to and cultivate? Does our community, and the oval and the church in the image in the center, this is about our community together. So as leaders, we need to have a view that it's our role as leaders to make sure our community understands that these issues of protection and prevention, this connects to our Christian faith. God cares that vulnerable people are respected, are protected, are not abused and exploited. So we'll walk through that and talk a lot about that. And as leaders, it's our job to help our community understand that this is not a side issue. This is not something we kind of check boxes off for our insurance company or our lawyers. Nothing against lawyers or insurance. But that's not the main reason we do this. We do this is because as Christians, God cares deeply about every human being made in His image. And God cares deeply about vulnerable people. And God calls leaders not to abuse power, but to use power as He does. Education. As leaders, we can cultivate education within our community. And that is, yes, with kids. And I've brought some books that if you haven't seen, here are some great books. We can encourage our families to be reading with their kids or grandkids. And we can use them in our church as well. But education for the whole community, not again out of paranoia or being scared, but that this is with an understanding we can be wise, we can be responsible, and we can be present and properly vigilant. Having clear boundaries or expectations for conduct, that it's an expectation that no one is alone with a student, for example. And a few other key boundaries. We're going to talk a lot about that today. And that sets the stage for accountability. That the boundaries are understood by the whole community, and that as a whole community, we're committed to holding anyone accountable for crossing a boundary, or certainly if there is something more egregious. And as leaders, we have to have a plan to make sure we're prepared if there are allegations, that we have to follow a process. That's a difficult thing because it's typically involving people we know, and there are some hard, complicated dynamics there. So we're going to talk a lot about that as well. So these are the 4 really critical areas that, again, I don't think it's rocket science, but again, these things don't just happen if we don't tend to them and aren't committed to working on them as leaders. All right. This is what I just said, but it's in the slides when you read it later. All right, we need to take our first break.